All right. Can you all hear me? Is a question. Is there sound? I think there's sound. I think there's sound. There we go. I'm dispense with the bear today. Um, since we're book reading, we don't need all that excitement. But thanks for joining. Thanks for tuning in. Welcome back to another episode of Book Reading Ministry for the Future. I think it's been a little while since we did one of these, and we're gonna. I think I'm gonna do a bunch this week of these book readings because, in lieu of the news, I think we're gonna do a couple of book readings this week. So, just because we need to get through it. If you are listening in or joining in, either during the live stream or afterwards, I do ask you kindly if you could donate, even $1 or $2 to the direct donation links, and they're all in the description box of whatever platform you're watching on. They're all there. Okay. We left off at chapter 44, and we're going to start chapter 45 of Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. Mary flew to San Francisco, where the U.S. Federal Reserve was hosting a meeting of some of the other big central banks. There was an annual meeting in Basel of all the central banks, convened by the Bank for International Settlements. But those were pro forma things. The real discussions usually happened elsewhere. And when the U.S. Federal Reserve called for a consultation, the other central banks usually showed up. This meeting was one of those, and the head of the Fed had welcomed Mary and given her a slot on the program. So it was time to talk things over with them in person, make the pitch for a carbon coin. Before that meeting began, she dropped in on the annual gathering of California Forward, having been invited to it by a young woman who had once interned for her. So a morning came when Mary walked with Esther over San Francisco's urban hills to the Moscone Convention Center. It was a brisk morning, the air almost as cool as in Zurich, but oceanic and windy. This and something intangible, maybe the hills or the light, gave the city a wild, open feel, very unlike staid old Zurich. Mary was very fond of Zurich, but this city overlooking its bay struck her in a different way as rather superb, basking under the windy Pacific sun and giving her, with each block they walked, new views in all directions. The California Forward meeting was an annual summit gathering for several score organizations. California, if it had been a nation, would now constitute the fifth biggest economy on Earth, and yet it also ran at carbon neutrality, having established strong policies early on. They were intent to continue that process, and obviously the people at the meeting felt what they were doing was a model other people could learn from. Mary was happy to be taught. Esther introduced her to people from the State Water Board, the California Native Plant Society, the University of California's Clean Energy Group, also its water group, also the head of the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the state's biodiversity leader, and so on. Together, a group of them walked her to a cable car terminus, and they all got on an open-sided cable car and rode it north to Fisherman's Wharf. Mary was surprised, thinking these quaint cars, canting up and down steep hills like Swiss cable cars attached to slots in the streets, were for tourists only. But her hosts assured her that they were as fast as any other transport across the city, and the cleanest as well. Up and down, squealing and clanking in the open air, and again she got the sense of a place enjoying its own sublimity. In some ways, It was the topological reverse of Zurich. The California Forward crowd, enthusiastically enough already, were now all bright-eyed and red-cheeked as if on holiday. From Fisherman's Wharf, they took a small water taxi to Sausalito, where a van drove them to a big warehouse. Inside the building, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had created a giant model of the California Bay Area and Delta, a 3D map with active water flows sloshing around on it. Here they could walk over the model landscape on low catwalks to see features better. And as they did that, the Californians told her and showed her the northern half of the state was now functioning. How the northern half of the state was now functioning. Pardon me. The state's Mediterranean climate, they told her, meant warm, dry summers and cool, wet winters, nurturing an immense area of fertile farmland, both on the coastal plains and in the state's great Central Valley. This Central Valley was really big, bigger than Ireland, bigger than the Netherlands, one of the chief breadbaskets of the world, but dry. Water had always been the weak link, and now climate change was making it worse. The entire state was now plumbed for water. They moved it around as needed, but when drought came, there was not much to move. And droughts were coming more and more frequently. Also occasional deluges. Either too little or too much was the new pattern, alternating without warning with droughts predominating. The upshot would be more forest fires, then more flash floods, and always the threat of an entire state going as dry as the Mojave Desert. Hydrologists pointed at the model below as they explained to Mary the water situation. Typically, the Sierra snowpack held about 15 million acre-feet of water every spring, releasing it to reservoirs and a slow melt through the long, dry summers. The dammed reservoirs in the foothills could hold about 40 million acre-feet when full. Then the groundwater basin underneath the Central Valley could hold around 1,000 million acre-feet, and that immense capacity might prove their salvation. In droughts, they could pump up groundwater and put it to use. Then during flood years, they needed to replenish that underground reservoir by capturing water on the land and not allowing it all to spew out the Golden Gate. To help accomplish all of this, they had passed a law, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which they called SGMA. In effect, it had created a new commons, which was water itself, owned by all and managed together. Records were kept, prices were set, allotments were dispensed, parts of the state had been taken out of agricultural production. In drought years, they pumped up groundwater, keeping close track, conserving all they could. In flood years, they caught water in the valley and helped it to sink into the basin. How they did this last part was a particular point of pride for them, as they had discovered that the Central Valley's floor was variably permeable. Much of it was as hard as a parquet floor, as one of them put it, but they had located several incised canyons, created when powerful flows of melted ice had poured off the Sierra ice cap at the end of the last 2 or 3 ice ages. These canyons had subsequently filled with Sierra boulders and had been slowly covered with dirt, so that they now looked just like the rest of the valley floor, but in fact, if water was trapped over them, they would serve as gigantic French drains, allowing water to sink into and through them, thus recharging the groundwater basin much faster than other areas would allow. So California's state government had bought or otherwise claimed the land over these French drain areas and built dams, dikes, levees, baffles, and channels to and fro, until now the entire valley was plumbed to direct heavy rainfall floods onto these old incised canyons, holding water there long enough for a lot of it to percolate down rather than run out to sea. Of course, There were limits to how much they could retain, but now pretty good flood control was combined with a robust recharge capacity so they could stock up in wet years and then pump again in the drought years that were sure to follow. If you are watching, please let me know in the chats if everything's okay with the sound. If I could just get a confirmation. I assume that it is, otherwise probably somebody would say something, but you never know. Anyways, good in itself, great, in fact. And not only that, this necessity to replumb the Great Valley for recharge had forced them to return a hefty percentage of the land to the kind of place it had been before Europeans arrived. The industrial agriculture of yesteryear had turned the valley into a giant factory floor, bereft of anything but products grown for sale, unsustainable, ugly, devastated, inhuman, and this in a place that had been called the Serengeti of North America, alive with millions of animals, including megafauna like Tule elk and grizzly bear and mountain lion and wolves. All those animals had been exterminated along with their habitat in the first settlers' frenzied quest to use the valley purely for food production, a kind of secondary gold rush. Now the necessity of dealing with droughts and floods meant that big areas of the valley were restored and the animals brought back, in a system of wilderness parks or habitat corridors, all running up into the foothills that ringed the Central Valley on all sides. These hills had always been wilder than the flat valley floor, and now they were being returned to native oak forests, which provided more shelter for wild creatures. Great. Thank you, Dan. Salmon runs had been reestablished. Tule marshes filled with old dry lake beds. Orchards were now grown that could live through periods of flooded land. Rice terracing was also built to retain floodwater, and they had been planted with genetically engineered rice strains that could stay flooded longer than previous strains. All these changes were part of an integrated system, including major urban and suburban retrofits. California's first infrastructure had been very shoddy and stupid, they told Mary. Cars and suburbs, plywood, and profit, another secondary gold rush, which had repeated the ugliness of the first one. Recovering from that crazy rush, redesigning, restoring, rebuilding, all that was going to take another century at least. But they were already a carbon-neutral society of 40 million people, headed to carbon negative. This was a work in progress, of course, and they were still grappling with equity issues, being tied to the rest of the world. But those two were being worked on until it would finally be the Golden State at last. All this they told Mary while looking down on the pretty model of the landscape filling the warehouse as if from a small airplane or satellite. Like a three-dimensional quilt, it seemed to her, the Lilliputian valley floor, a vivid patchwork of green, bordered and crisscrossed by what looked like hedgerows, but were actually miles-wide habitat corridors, reserved for wild animals. The surrounding foothills were pale blonde, dotted densely with dark green forest copses. "It looks great," Mary said. "I hope we can do this everywhere." "Models always look good," Esther said cheerfully, but she was proud of it. Not just the model, but the state. Back in San Francisco, she met the chair of the U.S. Federal Reserve on the top floor of the big tower, still the tallest skyscraper in the city. This meeting room gave them a view that made it seem as if they were almost as high as the peak of Mount Tamalpais. Looming there to the south of Sausalito, it reminded Mary of the day before, looking down on the model California, but this time it was real and vast. Alcatraz was a gray button in the blue plate of the bay. The bay's far shores were green and hilly. Out there to the west, the Farallon Islands, spiked out of the ocean like a sea serpent's black back. Little bridges crossed the bay here and there. The city itself was rumpled and urban, the white buildings and grid of streets interrupted by a few parks. It was a grand view, and as the meeting began, Mary found herself distracted by it. But quickly enough, what was happening in the room focused her attention. The Fed chair, Jane Yablonsky, had held her job for 9 years, with 3 more to go. She had the patient look of someone who had heard a lot of exciting proposals in her time and had come to distrust all of them. A little too patient for Mary's liking. About Mary's age, black-haired, attractive, in a silvery gray suit. Surrounded by assistants and some other Federal Reserve board members, she had been appointed by the previous president, and it was said that the current one was looking forward to replacing her. Joining the Americans were several other central bank representatives, including China, the European Union, the Bank of England, and the Bundesbank in Germany. Just the people Mary wanted to talk to. All central banks were curious hybrids, and the U.S. Federal Reserve was no exception. It was a federal agency, therefore a public bank, but it was funded by private banks. At the same time that it oversaw them, it created money, being along with the treasury, the seigniorage function of the United States. And between that and setting interest rates, it was thus responsible for the state of the U.S. dollar, the strongest currency in the world. The currency every other currency was pegged to, the one everyone ran to whenever there was a currency scare of any kind, the money of last resort, so to speak. In this sense, a very crucial sense, the American empire was alive and well. After some preliminary business, it was Mary's turn to make her pitch. She explained to them Janice Athena's idea for a carbon coin, wishing that she had J.A. there or Dick to help her with the explanation. But she needed to be able to describe it herself if it was going to make any headway, and the general ideas were clear to her. Yablonsky and the others had already heard of carbon quantitative easing, it turned out, and they were even familiar with the Chen paper and the associated discussions of it. Yablonsky did not look impressed. I don't see how we can get into the business of backing a currency that isn't the U.S. dollar, she said when Mary was done. The Federal Reserve exists to protect and stabilize the dollar, nothing else. That means stabilizing prices more generally, which means we pay attention to unemployment levels too and try to help there as we can. So this idea is not really in our purview. And if we tried this new alternative currency and it somehow destabilized or harmed the status of the dollar, we would be worse than derelict in our duty. Hi, Shani. This is Ministry for the Future. We've been reading this for a few months. It's a kind of a longer book and takes a while to read, but Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. Anyways, we would be derelict in our duty. Mary nodded. I understand. But you can't just quantitatively ease your way to a rapid transition out of the carbon economy. It costs too much, and it isn't profitable. And if you tried to simply QE your way to paying for it, that would undercut the dollar even more than our plan. And yet, something's got to be done. It's the vital work of our time. If we don't fund a rapid carbon drawdown, if we don't take the immense amount of capital that flows around the world looking for the highest rate of return and redirect it into decarbonizing work, civilization could crash. Then the dollar would be weak indeed. Yablonsky nodded, grimly amused. If the world ends, the dollar is in trouble. But aside from that contingency, we're here to defend it in the ways we've been given. That's what we're tasked with. Monetary policy, not fiscal policy. And the carbon tax proposals are gaining momentum, we feel. Mary said, but you need a carrot to go with the stick. The modeling shows that, not to mention common sense. Not our purview, Yablonsky said. The Europeans nodded in agreement. The Chinese official, an elderly man, looked on more sympathetically. But maybe it should be, Mary said. Now, Yablonsky looked displeased. This was her meeting, after all. Mary was there as a guest, making a pitch. And even though the global situation was urgent and the new tool promising, Yablonsky wasn't going to expose herself and her institution to that kind of heat without being ordered to do it by Congress. This was expressed very clearly just by the look on her face. It was the same with the Europeans. China might be different, but Mary didn't think China would lead on this issue. It needed everyone on board for it to work. All the central banks would have to agree to both the problem and the solution. If they decided not to back this plan, no one could coerce them to change their minds. They were delinked from their legislatures precisely to be able to avoid political pressure of any kind. Mary regarded them thinking it through. Because money ruled the world, these people ruled the world. They were the world's rulers in some very real sense. Bankers, non-democratic, answerable to no one. The technocratic elite at its most elite, financiers. Mary thought of her group back in Zurich. It was composed of experts in the various fields involved in the matter, people with all kinds of expertise, many of them scientists, all with extensive field experience of one sort or another. Here, she was looking at a banker, a banker, a banker, a banker, and a banker. Even if they understood an idea, even if they liked an idea, they wouldn't necessarily act on it. One principle for bankers in perilous times was to avoid doing anything too radical and untried. And so they were all going to go down. Looking out over San Francisco and its bay at Mount Tamalpais and the broad stretch of the Pacific, Mary heaved a sigh. This was not just a meeting of 2 women and 3 men, but of 5 teams, 5 institutions, 5 nation-states at the heart of the global nation-state system. The Paris Agreement's Ministry for the Future was small and impoverished, and these central banks were big and rich. Just because the need was urgent and her case was good, that didn't mean anything would change. You couldn't change things with just an idea, no matter how good it was. Was that right? It felt right. Power was entrenched. But that phrase caught just a hint of the situation. Actually, the trenches were foundations that went right to the center of the earth. It could not be changed. The meeting dragged to a close. Time to get a drink. Nothing had happened. That's the end of chapter 45. And I had a bit of commentary on that chapter just because, well, they were saying that, again, this is a semi-science fiction or semi-future looking book. So it was all very nice that they were talking about California being carbon neutral, but in order for that to actually happen, you'd have to have a state government that was, slightly less corrupt, and I mean that in a very joking way, slightly less corrupt than it is now. So the chances of that actually being a reality are kind of far away, unfortunately. And then the other part about how they described the Federal Reserve was silly. Has a little Octavia Butler. Yes, it does. And Would love to actually read some Octavia Butler. Um, uh, yeah, the description of the Federal Reserve was a little bit silly. Like, oh, it's just, we're here to serve the government and not operate the puppet strings. Anyways, there's a lot more to say about it. This is fiction nonetheless. Okay. Chapter 46. We're about halfway. I'm going to do like 45, 50 minutes, guys, and then, we'll go from there. We'll see where we end up. Chapter 46. I was born small, as so many things are. A marsupial, perhaps. People came to me and reached inside me to pass things to each other. I helped them do that. When I was young, I had no blood, and people moving things around inside me had to do it by feel. They had to decide by feel alone which things were equally useful to them. And so few things are equally useful. Indeed, only two identical things are equally useful. 2 hearts, 2 livers, 2 drops of blood. So in people's attempts to pass things around, there was friction. It was time-consuming and unsatisfactory. People would sometimes say, all things being equal, but this was never the case. So I was judged to have a difficult and unsatisfactory body until my blood finally came into me, and stomach acids, all the fluids of metamorphosis of life. Then things dropped into me could be digested and moved elsewhere in my body to do something else. My stomach made disparate things the same by way of digestion into blood. This made food of all the things brought into me, and I quickly grew. I am an omnivore, and as I grew, I ate more and more. Everything fed to me made other things. I digested things and turned them into blood, which moved around in me and helped to reconstitute some other things of use, bone or muscle or some vital organ. Helping in this process were my mouth, esophagus, intestine, arteries, and veins, all of which grew with me, making a whole body out of which new things, also useful, could grow, things people wanted. I grew and grew and grew. In this process, as in any body, there were useless residues not taken up in the new process, which left me in the usual way, thus sweat, urine, shit, tears. My body worked so well that eventually all things everywhere were swallowed and digested by me. I grew so large that I ate the world, and all the blood in the world is mine. What am I? You know, even though you are like everything else and see me from the inside. I am the market. Okay. Scary. That was chapter 46. Scary but true. Okay, chapter 47. Sorry, I'm just trying to see how long this chapter might be. Rather long. Okay, this might be the last chapter I read today. We'll see. Chapter 47. He spent his days around Zurich, on the shores of the Zurich Sea, sorry. Mostly the eastern shore. Sometimes he would feel an urge to see women's bodies, a useless and hopeless urge, but since it could be indulged in this city, he would go to Tiefenbrunnen Park on the lakeshore, pay at the gate, and go in and sit down by the water and try not to be too obvious as the topless women walked by him going in and out of the lake. Swiss women, so stolidly Swiss in their voices, so gorgeous in their pale skin wet in the sun. It was a bit much, a bit too clear what he was up to. And he saw also the other single men sitting around just by coincidence, not looking at anyone, and yet undoubtedly there to drink in the sight of so many women's bodies. No, it was too obvious, too much in several different ways. And after a while, he would leave and wander the streets of the neighborhood behind the lake. There was a house there that had been turned into a small art museum, apparently the house owner's personal collection, now open to the public. Some of the greatest paintings he had ever seen were just hanging on the walls of an ordinary little house. Or walk up along the shore to the bridge that spanned the lake's outlet, where the Limmat left the lake, always interesting to look at, that first dip and pour in the black sheet of water. Swans floated under the stone wall just east of this bridge, the wall dropping direct from park grass to lake surface, the swans hoping for children to throw them breadcrumbs down to them. Unearthly, incandescent white birds floating on black water, or over to the little park where the statue of the Ganymede held his arms up against the distant Alps. Other days he would walk the trails around the top of the Zurberg, over to the cemetery where James Joyce was buried, a life-sized bronze statue of the writer, always ready for a silent conversation, sitting there reading his bronze book through round bronze spectacles, which nicely emphasized his near blindness. A bronze cigarette held on his bent bronze knee. The tall trees on the Zurberg were mostly clear of the underbrush, and one could leave the dusty trails through the trees and wander among them, looking for nothing. Distant views of the Alps, better from up here than down in the city. The peaks farthest south were snow-capped and looked completely vertical, like cardboard cutout mountains at the back of a stage set. Then through the trees to the path circling the top of the hill, and on to one of the steep residential streets dropping into the city proper. Past his secret garden shed, down through houses with their tiny yards, often with statuary in them. A big, naked concrete woman held a green looped hose over her extended arm, reminding him of the casual women at Tiefenbrunn. Or of Serene and her little girls, Emma and Heba. How he regretted all of that, his inability to hold it together, to be there for them. He couldn't think about it, miserable at the thought of it, but he still couldn't avoid obsessing about what hurt him. Something was broken in his head. He wanted to get better, but it didn't happen. He wanted to go back to working with refugees, though it would have to be at a different center, not the one where he had met them. That wouldn't be a problem. There were many of them in the region, but when he tried one, he realized it was just reminding him of how badly he had fucked up with Serene and the girls. Just another trigger. It didn't matter that it wasn't the same place, because they were all the same place, really. Always the same place, always the same day. So down to the Utequai Schwimmbad, where you could rent a locker and suit up and step down into the lake itself and go for a swim until you were too cold to think, too cold to feel. Then get out and shower and have a coffee fertig afterward. A drink that would indeed finish you, but in a good way. And yet always he was hiding. Always he felt sick and broken. There was no way to ignore the surveillance cameras mounted almost everywhere, Not that Jacob Salzman was being looked for, apparently. Someone had posted a map of all the cameras in the cities, supposedly, but there were never cameras that were much smaller than the previous ones. But there were newer cameras that were much smaller than the previous ones. The bigger ones were there to remind you that you were under surveillance, whereas the smaller ones were there to surveil. So it didn't make much sense to avoid the bigger ones, because surely everyone was always surveilled all the time. Quite possibly every human alive had a team of little drones following them. That was the only hope, in a way, in terms of lying low, that there were too many people to follow, too much data, and good reason by now to feel that he was not presently flagged as being of interest. He had his ID and his legend, and unless what had happened to him in his youth made the authorities look for him again for some reason, he should be okay. And he had not been that person for many years. 6 or 7 years. No, 9. So he wore hats and sunglasses and grew a beard, and sometimes put a mouthguard in his mouth when out, and wore different kinds of clothing. He tried to be 4 distinctly different people for the cameras, with the one that was really him at the least often at large. See if the algorithms could sort that out. And given the 8 billion people they were tracking, it seemed possible he could slide under the radar. In any case, he had to walk around, had to get out into the city. He couldn't hide in a room all day, every day. He had tried that for a while, and it didn't work. It had almost killed him. One day, he saw a notice on a message board announcing a meeting of the 2,000 Watt Society. He looked it up and decided to go to the meeting. It was held in the back room of a little Italian restaurant west of the Hauptbahnhof called Mamma Mia's. By the time the meeting started, about 50 people had jammed into the room. They looked like any other Swiss people, perhaps a little more bohemian in style, but not much. The Swiss were extremely regular in their appearance, but then, on consideration, Frank realized that this was basically true everywhere. The meeting began on time, of course, and it had a schedule that was gotten through briskly. Frank's German was not up to the task, and this way, Schweizerdeutsch to boot. And this was Schweizerdeutsch to boot. So he was completely lost and could only pretend to be comprehending. But no one seemed to notice. Their guttural, looping sentences were calm, and they laughed pretty often. When they saw that he was there, and that there were some other Auslander there also, they summarized their proceedings in quick, rough English. He liked the feel of the meeting, nothing dogmatic or virtuous about it, just people pursuing a project, something between a committee meeting and a party planning exercise. Like the local Swiss Alpine Club, no doubt. And in fact, when he was asked about that, he found that many there were in both clubs. Party planning, political parties. He wondered if the same word for both was the case in German also. Partei, yes. But birthday party, maybe so. He wished he had brought along a translation earbud. Back home, he looked again at the Society's online information, started in Basel and Zurich about 40 years before. The idea was that the total global energy generated by people, when divided by the number of people on Earth, came to about 2,000 watts per person. So the people in the society had decided to live on that much energy and see how it felt. The 2,000 watts were to cover food, transport, home heating, and home utilities. When Frank saw the breakdown, he realized that his lifestyle was already well within the limits prescribed by the society. That made him laugh. Swiss citizens in general used about 5,000 watts. This was compared to 6,000 in the rest of Western Europe. Chinese citizens about 1,500, 1,000 in India, 12,000 in the United States. His country, the great whale in this as in everything, slurping down the world. In Switzerland, their current usage per person cost about 1,500 watts for one's living space, including heat and hot water, 1,100 watts for food and consumer discretionary, 600 watts for electricity, which included power for a refrigerator, 500 watts for automobile travel, 250 watts for air travel, 150 watts for public transport, trains, trams, and subways, 900 watts for public infrastructure. Frank wasn't sure what that meant, but presumably in this case the cost of the library, the Bahnhof, the sewer systems, and so on. He considered the list for a while. The Swiss hoped to achieve the reduction from 5,000 watts per citizen to 2,000 mainly by swapping out their entire built infrastructure to make it more energy efficient. They hoped that their economy would grow by 65%. At the same time that they were reducing their energy per person, and they wanted their people to live pretty much as they had before. No hair shirt, no saintly suffering, no Francis of Assisi mentality or behavior. This was Switzerland, not a monastery. Stolid burger watchmakers, cheesemakers, made fun of by the rest of the world, or envied, or really both at once. In fact, it was a bit mysterious how the Swiss had gotten so prosperous. Some still pointed to the deep past, including their mercenary soldiers and guards, their banks holding criminals' money, and so on. But it had to be more than that. Chemicals, pharmaceuticals, engineering systems, all the minutiae of daily life that the rest of the world couldn't be bothered to master. Like Swiss watches in their day. But no one wore watches anymore, so they had moved on to something else. Manufacturing of almost anything was cheaper in China and India, so again, on to something else. Or to the kinds of manufacturing that required exceptionally good quality control. On and on it went, with only 35% of their little country useful for agriculture or even habitable by humans at all. It was strange. And then there were the four language groups. The German speakers were numerous, more than the French, then the Italians, then the Romanche, who numbered only 50,000 or so, and yet flourished in their little corner of the country. The Swiss were proud to assert that they had made Romanche an official Swiss language, in defiance of Hitler's raving about Aryan supremacy. And as far as Frank could discover, there was some truth to this, even though the defiance had been rather indirect and symbolic, as the Swiss had already been allowing the German and Italian militaries free passage across Switzerland at the time. Still, it was a nice gesture towards language diversity, right when national governments in France and other countries were crushing their local dialects. The Swiss had always slanted against the grain, always pushed against the received wisdom that tended to wash over the rest of Europe in waves of intellectual fashion, everything from details of fashion to participation in world wars. So, fine, the Swiss were mysterious, but this 2,000 watt project was a good idea. Frank already had it covered. He used an almost Bangladeshi amount of energy per year. He lived in an apartment or a garden shed. He didn't even own a car and never rented one. He had stopped flying. He ate mostly vegetarian. There were websites on which one could calculate one's energy burn quite closely, using electricity bills and estimates of mileage on various transport systems and grocery lists. These calculators had existed from the start of the century or before. But as far as Frank could tell, no one used them. It was like avoiding the scale when you were overweight. Who wanted Such bad news. Scrolling around as he had thought about it, he ran across one essay that said the people of the world could still be divided into roughly 3 groups of wealth and consumption, measured by their transport methods. A third of the world traveled by car and jet, a third by train and bicycle. The final third was still on foot. He thought about that for a while. He walked a lot. It was easy in Zurich, a form of entertainment. That was true in many cities as far as he knew. There were a few that were unwalkable, like Los Angeles, for which planners had struggled to invent new names, like conurbation or agglomeration or megacity. But in most cities, walking still worked, at least in their central districts and their various nodes. Anyways, it was no great deprivation to get back on foot if you lived in a city like Zurich. Of course, it was good to get out of town sometimes, see something different. That meant trains and trams. But the watts used could be calculated there too. The 2000 Watt Society had provided its members with lots of graphs to estimate individual use. Watts per kilometer even. Apparently he didn't travel much compared to most people. That felt right. If you were mentally ill, your energy use inevitably dropped because you couldn't put it together to live a normal life. He had gone to ground. He was living in a hole like a badger, hibernating maybe, waiting for some kind of spring to come. In any case, strictly regarding standard of living relative to energy use, he was doing well. He was a comfortable badger, and it was interesting to think about life as a consumption of energy. It was now part of his project, his self-medication. One therapist had questioned it once as possibly some kind of self-punishment, but he didn't think so. He didn't feel his various forms of self-medication as more or less virtuous. Self-reliance was always a delusion. He relied on other people as much as anyone. He knew that. But it was interesting to try to do more with less. At the very least, it passed the time, and it kept him off some of the cameras. He started going down the hill to a refugee aid center in North Zurich to help with the free dinners offered there 2 nights a week. No more fraternizing with the refugees. That had clearly been a mistake, something beyond his capacities. But he could at least work, put his shoulder to the wheel, help turn the world. The organizers of these particular evening dinners were mostly Swiss women. And the workers who assembled to help them were from various charitable or aid organizations or school groups or churches or people who were working off some kind of school or legal trouble by doing community service. The organizers only wanted first names from helpers, and they didn't ask questions. While he was there, he helped to set up tables and chairs and tablecloths, put out cutlery, and cut donated cakes and pies into portions, and did a lot of kitchen and dining room cleanup. It was simple and calming, and there was time to sit or kneel by some of their guests and ask how they were doing without getting involved in their lives beyond that. Some of the guests didn't want to talk, especially in English. Some appreciated the chance. It was easy to tell which was which. The space for these meals was some kind of civic hall, as far as he could tell, near the first bridge over the Lamont, downstream from the Hauptbahnhof Bridge. There were mini parks at both ends of the bridge to give Zurchers the no doubt satisfying spectacle of their tamed river flowing under them, through the gateway created by one of their massively over-engineered bridges. It was indeed pretty mesmerizing. Frank watched for a long time as the water purled over a drop downstream from the bridge, like some kind of cake batter flowing in a giant mixer. One of the setup crew for the dinner called this area Needle Park, or so it seemed to Frank, as it had been said in Swiss German, and he didn't know if he had caught the words right. Apparently a drug dealer's area back in the day, or even now, if Frank understood correctly. There was a needle dispensary nearby. These days, it was also a place where various refugees out of the camps for the day gathered before and after the free meals. Possibly something illicit was still being done in the two parks he didn't know. Pairs of police would walk across the bridge occasionally, and sometimes they would stop and talk to people, but there was never any sign that they were confronting crime or causing guilty parties to run and reveal themselves. In general, the feel around Swiss police officers on patrol was completely different from what Frank remembered from his childhood. At home, the presence of police meant trouble. Something was wrong. Guns might be involved. The big uniformed men were faintly menacing. Here in Zurich and elsewhere around Switzerland, the police had the same vibe as train conductors, and they often carried similar-looking scanning boxes. They seldom carried weapons. And there were about as many women officers as men. It seemed like they usually worked in pairs, a woman and a man, patrolling together doing something like outdoor marriage counseling. This chapter is long. They did approach people. They did ask questions. But here, too, they resembled tram conductors because Zurich's trams operated on the honor principle, and everyone bought tickets at kiosks or had annual passes. But conductors asking people to show their passes appeared on about one ride in every 50. They wandered through the cars, and as people saw them, they produced their ticket or their annual passes, and the conductors passed on with a nod. Very seldom were there free riders, and many of these were tourists who had misunderstood the system. Same in the park, or so it seemed. Legal? The passing police seemed to be asking just by their presence. Yes, legal. Genau. People would say in conversation with them, meaning exactly. A word the Swiss loved and used all the time, as in okay, or sure, or yeah, right. Exactly. And with a nod, that police would pass on the people too. But as Frank spent more time in these two little needle parks, he began to see that there might be some people here functioning as nodes in some kind of refugee underground railroad. Groups of 10 or a dozen people, looking like 2 or 3 families, would sit on a couple of benches or on the grass if it was dry enough and talk among themselves, looking around warily. They looked like they were from somewhere else. They weren't Swiss. They could have been from the Middle East or South Asia or Africa or South America. Then someone who usually looked ex-Swiss would approach them and speak in their language. Frank usually couldn't hear well enough to tell more than the fact that it wasn't German or English, and the group would get up and follow that person away. Given there were surveillance cameras mounted on the streetlight posts, it had to be obvious to the authorities watching or to their algorithms that something was going on here. And yet it went on day after day. He couldn't tell what it was. He couldn't speak the languages. English was the world's lingua franca, no doubt about it, and he heard a lot of that. But he couldn't join in the project of finding ways to help get these people into a place of greater safety, so he kept his distance. Any kind of aid offered on the spot was inherently suspicious. Best to stay uninvolved, to pitch in with the free meals and leave it at that. Still, he began to go to the meals wearing a hat with the Zurich cantonal shield on it, the blue and the white. Then he would walk around the 2 bridge parks with children's down parkas stuffed in little bags, or little umbrellas collapsed on their stems into short, squat cylinders, and if he saw foreign children shivering, he would approach the groups and say to the adults, für die Kinder sehr warm, and then quickly got away with a danke, mi foi, said over his shoulder. This being the Zurcher's own sweet mashup of German and French, particular to their city, he would leave them his little bundles, and often on cold evenings the adult women in the group would nod gratefully. Off Frank would go. Jomoli sold these jackets and umbrellas for 10 francs each, so it was an easy way to help a little. Switzerland was cold and raw on winter afternoons when the wind swept down the lake and through the town. Crossing a bridge often felt colder to him than Antarctica had felt. It was like Glasgow in that regard. A chill, raw, wet wind was far colder on the skin than a dry stillness of a far lower temperature. And some of these people were unprepared for that. One time, one of the refugees in the park on the eastern side of the bridge was sick and fell after perhaps fainting. A quick little crowd surrounded him, and Frank joined them to see what he could do, his heart racing. He saw none of them seemed to have mobile phones, or maybe they were afraid to use them, and so he went to the little phone box on the bridge end and punched the button for the local 911. Then asked for help in German, giving the situation and then the address, which he assumed they already had. He felt a brief sense of accomplishment in saying all that in German, and then stood at the edge of the group watching, feeling so sick he worried that he, too, would keel over. When the ambulance arrived with its weird European siren, most of the people surrounding the stricken man disappeared. The emergency medical people approached, and then a pair of police, both women. More refugees disappeared until it was only the stricken one and Frank. Frank gestured the police over. One of them held a scanner in front of the man's face and clicked a photo and looked at the result. Possibly there would be an RFID embedded in the man's skin too, there to be read by the scanner. Then the policewoman with the scanner glanced at Frank and stood straight, holding the scanner towards him, gesturing at him with her other hand. The other policeman said, "Nine," Swiss for 9. And the other one with the scanner returned to the stricken person. Frank nodded his appreciation to the one who had stopped her colleague, and when the emergency crew had the young man on a stretcher, Frank turned and walked away, shivering in the chill gray wind. In the summers it was different. Some organization, maybe the Red Cross, maybe the Red Crescent, often set up a big open-sided tent in the Western Bridge Park and cooked food and gave out free meals. They were uninterested in finding out who they were serving. It was all anonymous on both sides of the table. It got hot and steamy on some days, which put Frank on edge, but he ignored that and did what he could to help. Set up, clean up. He didn't serve food, and he tried not to look at the people eating. It was too hot, too familiar. He didn't want to recognize what he was feeling. He looked around under the edge of the tent roof to see Zurich sights, the stone, the trees, the blue, and the white. Smell of bratwurst and beer, red geraniums, stolid medieval edge of the Rathaus. There upriver, as far as he could see, visible through linden trees. Cold northern land, cool, sober people, cool to the eye and the mind. But not the people taking refuge here. The Fremdenkontroll, the stranger control, a bureau of the police, estimated that there were now 5 million native Swiss and 3 million Ausländer within the borders. This ratio, one of the most extreme in the world, had caused membership in the various right-wing anti-immigration parties in Switzerland to swell. And now they held a dozen or more seats in the Swiss legislature, led by the SVP, the Swiss People's Party. There were about 30 political parties in Switzerland, and all the ruling coalitions in the federal government were formed by majorities created by alliances between the central parties, center-right, center-left, with the more radical parties on each side just barely earning seats. SVP had even held a majority for a while, then after the heat wave, it had lost popularity. Now they did better in the cantonal governments, but these had had their power shifted over the years to Bern's federal government, not entirely. But in national matters like this one, the federal government tended to get its way. The upshot seemed to be that there was a lot of pent-up anger in the anti-immigration crowd as they saw their country being overrun with nothing they could do about it, at the political level anyway. Maybe it was this way everywhere. Now, whenever Frank saw small groups of obvious Auslander, people from the global south or even the Balkans, walking in areas of the city where they might get accosted, he would strike up a conversation with them in English and walk with them. He saw it help once or twice. Racists were confused by mixed race situations, so a white man with these dark-skinned people gave them pause. If it were a dark-skinned man with a Swiss woman, it might make them angry, even though this was a common sight. But a white man with people of color was different. And anyway, it took some evaluation before any racist could decide to get angry, so that created some time, and if one walked fast, staying on lit streets, which in Zurich meant any street, not an alley in the Niederdorf, it would be enough to keep from getting assaulted, except by some guttural comments hurled one's way, comments designed not to be understood, so he walked with them when he could. But then the day came when he saw a group of young Swiss men standing on the bridge looking at the big meal tent. Though it was hot, the air had gone dark. There were clouds building overhead. A thunderstorm was imminent. It would be a relief when it came, for now it was getting hotter. Big fat raindrops began to spatter the pavers outside the tent. All of a sudden, they were in a downpour, and at that same moment, the young Swiss men charged the tent, throwing pavers and shouting. They were going for the servers as well as the guests, and people were screaming and going down. There was blood splashing from nowhere into reality, and seeing that, many of the refugees charged their assailants, screaming with fury. Pavers gone, the Swiss thugs had nothing but their fists, but they too were enraged, and a Donnybrook of punching and shoving and shouting erupted outside one edge of the tent. The Swiss who ran away were tackled or kicked in the back, the moves familiar and practiced from soccer pitches at their worst. The Swiss thugs then realized they had to retreat while still facing the refugee fighters, at least until they could get a clear route away. Some of them ran across a street right in front of a tram, which squealed down past them and gave them some cover for their retreat. After that, wet people, screaming, crying, blood on the ground and on the tabletops, which were now commandeered to lay injured people on something other than the cold, wet ground. Police arrived, and the clumps of quivering, shouting people surrounded them to tell the tale of outrage. The police teams went from person to person in the following hour, and Frank stayed, too upset by what he had seen to leave. He had to testify, but everyone the police interviewed, they were also scanning, and when they were done talking to Frank, having done the same to him, they looked at each other. One of them was showing his scanner to his colleagues. These approached Frank and then surrounded him. "Sorry," one of them said to him in English, "there is a warrant out for your arrest. Please come with us." All right. That's the end of chapter 47 of Ministry for the Future, and we're going to end it there for today. Thanks for hanging out, guys. There's a couple interesting things in that paragraph too, or that, not paragraph, chapter. Oh, thank you, Osama. I appreciate that. I think, get a coffee from Osama. Thanks, man. Appreciate you. He said thanks for reading. Don't know if there's any others. When he was talking about this, the everybody being tracked and followed, and the surveillance part of that, I was just listening to something interesting about from Catherine Austin Fitz, if you guys know who she is, and she was talking about people having a team of algorithms like basically following them around and spying on them, which is a very creepy thought, but it's true. If you're on any digital devices and you're not, and even if you are taking precautions, you're still being tracked and followed. You have to really be quite thorough if you're trying to be completely private in the digital world. What was the other part that actually I was thinking about? And I can't remember the other part I was thinking about in that chapter. But anyways, good stuff. I really love this book, and we'll keep reading. I'm going to do a couple more readings this week, I think, because I want to get through it, and we're not even close. All right, thanks, guys. See you on Monday. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed. Everybody listening in on Rumble, Rockfin, YouTube. Until next time, peace.